Hi, hello, and welcome to the Book Summary Network, or BSN, 00000. And today will be the first book, because of our quiz tomorrow, Elizabeth Bowen, The Heat of the Day. So essentially, this whole thing is just I read the book, so you don't have to, and I'm going to give you like the big chapter by chapter plot points of like what I think are the most important aspects of the book. None of that like nuanced stuff. I'll tell you a little bit about the characters themselves, but it's not like this book, especially being at like 372 pages, is so full of like minor character details that depend on the scene that they're in or the person that they're talking to or the other character. So essentially, in chapter one, or I guess some background about the book itself, we know that it was started in 1942 and actually published in 1948. So post World War II, but started in the middle of it. And in chapter one, we start out in a open theater on a Sunday evening in late autumn, of a Viennese concert. And basically, we get introduced to two characters: one who isn't named, a male, who we'll learn later is Harrison, and a girl named Louie Lewis. Actually, that's her full name. And it's the whole first chapter is essentially like this conversation or interaction between these two characters, and it's kind of like banter, but it's kind of like bickering, as like Harrison's very nervous, and Louis can tell this by like his body language and stuff. And in it, we get a little bit more detail about Louis herself, where we get a small backstory of a date she had with an airman. And this is important because she's actually married, and her husband Tom has been drafted into the military and is currently in India. When they were together, live in a small house on Chillicombe Street. She works in a factory, and their parents have been killed in a bomb previously. Tom, before the war, was an electrician, and they got married in 1939. Those are like the most important details that you get for Louis herself and of the scene in chapter one. The chapter basically ends with Harrison leaving towards Stella's house, because he has to get to her house because of reasons that we see in chapter two. Chapter two starts off with Stella's point of view. Full name: Stella Rodney. And basically, she has left her house a mess, because she wants to show Harrison, who she's expecting, that she doesn't actually care about him. Her flat, I guess we should call because London, her flat is on Weymouth Street. And we learn in this chapter that she got it in 1940, and she also has a 20-year-old son named Roderick, who's in the army, and that both her parents are dead, and her two brothers died in school fighting quote-unquote Flanders, which I don't exactly know what that is. We also learned that her first marriage was actually a failure. And she works in an organization called YXD, which we know from in class. Our teacher said possibly because it says that she does like not unimportant work, so she does like pseudo important information work, as we can tell because of YXD is like an acronym for something. And then the rest of the scene basically is just like Harrison comes in and he's talking to Stella, and he's being coy about it. He's being very like intrusive and very prying into her private life, picking up photographs and noting about the furniture in China, fine china that she has in her house. And then it kind of comes to this point where he's like, you know, the guy you've been seeing, because I know the guy you've been seeing, the guy she's been seeing, Robert Kelway. He goes, he's actually a counter spy for the Germans and has been giving them information because he works in the War Office. And so basically, I know this because I'm a spy. And if you don't break up with him and start dating me, then I'm going to put him under because I have the power to do so. And then it just starts this is where the drama really starts. And they're like arguing and stuff like that. The scene basically ends with Harrison leaving because Roderick calls Stella on the phone, on the telly. He tells her that he's coming home, like unprompted, which she notes is very unusual. Chapter 3 is a whole scene about Roger coming home from like war. He's been like deployed for a long time, it seems, and he comes home and just like puts his feet up on the couch. He takes like a hot bath. She makes like some tea, and they eat some like stale cookies. So she wasn't prepared for him to come home. And then we get noted for the whole character. We get started on the character plot for Roderick, and it turns out that the relative of her dead ex-husband, cousin Francis, has just put in his will to give Roderick the property that he owned at Mount Morris called Wisteria Lodge. And it also notes in the book that it's because he wanted him to be like a secondary son because his son like died or whatever. But it doesn't matter because it kind of doesn't come up. We see that this starts the whole character arc for Roderick, and basically he becomes like severely changed. Kind of like we don't really know what he was like beforehand, but after this, it's like everything he talks about is his property, and that he will own it, especially because he's so young after the war. They talk about the property, and then Roderick questions like Harrison because he notices like, oh, he left a lot of ashes. He must have been here for very long. He's like being coy with her, saying like, oh, he must really like you or whatever. The scene kind of ends with Roderick finding a piece of folded up paper in the dressing gown that he's wearing because he took a bath. That dressing gown has note because it's actually Robert's that has been left over at Stella's place. And this piece of paper is super important because it possibly, like we said in class, like shows like where Stella has her allegiances, where her love lies, but it also could have very important spy information. So Roger kind of like holds it up and is like, "Is this yours?" Whatever, and then Stella snatches it away, and then in the end, after they fight over a little bit, like sort of philosophically about like stealing other people's information, and if it's actually hers or not. She sees that it's nothing and then tears it up in his face. They throw it away. And then Roger goes to sleep. And while he's falling asleep, she gets a phone call. We aren't exactly sure who is on the other side because a lot of this book is like parts of it is just one-sided conversations over the phone and stuff that we get. But that's the end of chapter 3, essentially. Chapter 4 is the funeral for Cousin Francis. Because of the war, his body wasn't able to go back to Ireland. The funeral had to happen in England. But Roger couldn't attend because of military business, so Stella goes in his place. We find out doesn't actually know the rest of the family very much, and actually only met cousin Francis like 4 months prior to his death. But most crazy part is Harrison is actually there. She doesn't know why until later when he tells her. But nobody there at the funeral knows who he is, and nobody knows why he is there. So a lot of the pressure for Stella gets taken off of her for it. And then there's a lot of conversation about like just some BS essentially, until like Harrison shows up and he says like why he's here, because he actually knew cousin Francis because it's like some pseudo spy business. It's rumored that Francis died in a bombing accident, and he's such a good friend of Francis that he actually was like the last person that we know saw Francis before Francis died, and has some papers left in his hotel, and that's like a whole side plot point that doesn't really go anywhere. It just leads to the fact that probably he was in on some spy business or whatever, and that Harrison is like a lot more in Stella's life now because of like this connection through family. Only other like person of note of the family members is Colonel Pole, who is an old friend of Francis, and he just says some stuff about like Roderick and owning this property, stuff like that. Another thing to note is that the wife of cousin Francis, cousin Nettie, is mentally unwell. She's quote unquote queer, as queer is used as like weird in this time period. So it's like she's like the queerest person around, which is so silly. And also we learned that Victor, her previous husband, was in the First World War, and had after it coming out of it really shaken up. Chapter 5 is one of those shorter chapters. Like there's like big chapters where there's like a lot of like not necessarily plot happens, but a lot of stuff we learn about these characters happen. And then there's like chapters in between them that like we'll see with Connie, who's a friend of Louis, and it's kind of just like one character's like little perspective of the scene that literally just happened prior, and then that's about it. So in chapter 5, we learn that Robert, her Stella's boyfriend right now, was in Dunkirk and was discharged from the military because of his injury to his leg, which left him like not lame, but he has a limp. We also learned that she met Robert in 1940 at a bar or club. They actually don't know. And then the rest of the chapter kind of just details them quickly falling in love, and they're all so romantic. Da, 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 da. Nothing really quite plot happens. And then the only last thing, that this chapter kind of ends on this discussion of a tie, which comes about like way later in the book, where it's like, so it was like, the discussion of the tie had like some meaning to whatever. Da, da, da. At this point, Stella, doesn't know if Robert is actually a spy or not, and there's this whole Harrison thing. Chapter 6 starts with Stella meeting all of Robert's family in October, as they had decided like previously in the last chapter that she should probably meet his family. Yes. So now it's like since like a month later since the beginning of the book, and that his family lives on a house they keep up for sale because his father realizing like immediately after they bought it that it was a bad purchase and then they need to sell it. But it hasn't been sold due to the war. It's been kind of left in the stationary area. The house is located in Holmdene, which is close to the border of possible German invasion. It was built in the 1900s and is apparently a considerable manor, as like I think 6 people live in it. This is where we meet a lot of Robert's like family. First, we meet his sister, Ehrenstein. Ehrenstein? Eristine? He calls her Ernie. And she's older than him by like 12 years and is actually a widow. She has her own son. His name is Christopher Robin. And Ernie is freaking weird. If I were to imagine just walking and hearing somebody laughing, coming upon them, not figuring out what they were laughing about, and then asking their brother what she was laughing about, and he says, "Oh, probably nothing." There's something mentally probably unwell about her. That's just my take, though. We learned that she works at the WVS, which I have no idea what it is, but she works at it and apparently gets called a lot about it. We also find about his mother, Miss Moodykins is like her nickname and stuff, and she's very like high and stringent for like the whole family and stuff, and it causes a lot of like stress and problems or whatever for Robert, and especially his dad, who is out of the picture at this moment. And we learn that like Robert's dad was kind of like very heavily demasculated by Moodykins and kind of like ran over like everything in his life. And Robert has like some reservations about this, we see, and this leads to like his decisions later in the book. We also learn about one of Roderick's other sisters, Amabel. Not A, it's with an M, Amabel. And she has 2 children named Peter and Anne, and I believe Amabel is the girl who having been married into the ICS is now confined by the war to India. So this comes up later as like a side point, but like besides her children, she's not there in the actual rest of the story. She meets a bunch of these people. They have tea. There's a whole discussion about like how the war is actually hitting differently for people in London versus people in the outskirts, like where they live. The scene kind of ends after like it's a super uncomfortable scene, as it just like the general family dynamic is just like super weird and awkward, and with Stella being a complete stranger being put into this, it's just a whole bunch of awkwardness. But at the end, we learn that Moodykins actually has a package that she wants delivered, and she knows that there's stuff open apparently on Sunday in London. And so Stella, being a girlfriend's like, oh, I could do it, and takes all the package and stuff into her responsibility. Okay, so then chapter 7 is a heavy dialogue scene where we go back to, we're leaving Moodykins and them and all of them, and Stella and Robert go back into London. And basically, Robert goes off because he has work to do, which we don't know what work it is, but we know he has work to do. And Stella comes back home, and Harrison's just kind of standing outside her house, like late at night, and it's just like, I was waiting. And Stella's like, well, I guess come in. And then they have just this, it is like 10 pages of them just straight up like discussing and like kind of pseudo arguing. about like his proposition and what she's doing. Has she told Robert anything? Oh, I do want to make this clear that Harrison has made it clear that he will know that she told him, and if Robert knows that he knows, because of like some psychology BS. Chapter 7 ends with Harrison taking up the package and being like, "I can do this for you," very simple. Like chapter 8 starts with Louis, and we haven't actually seen Louis for like 6 chapters at this point, and we get introduced to her friend named Connie. We find that Louis is looking actually for Harrison at the park, and this becomes like this kind of becomes like her thing, that she's always looking for Harrison or looking for another man or something, but she's very entranced by Harrison and the way that he acted in their first like meeting. We learn that she is of Kentish seacoast descent, and is also an orphan. So she's not from London. This becomes kind of like one of the themes of people who actually are from London versus not from London, and how that like interacts in the like sociability of all of them together. We also learn a lot about Connie, who is an ARP warden and actually lives with Louis. Louis had written to her husband, and leaving out some details, they're writing back and forth is kind of the only way of communication between them. And then the rest of them is just Louis and Connie kind of talking about war, her husband, Louis trying to date other people, and just kind of in general, just like it's a very like, it's hard to say, but it's kind of very like slice of life for a lot of these like chapters in between like major plot points of like going to a funeral or something like that. So chapter 9 starts with Robert and Stella talking about Roger specifically and his inheritance. This starts in her flat, as Stella is off the next day to the actual property to check it out. Then she leaves, and we get like a very vivid description of a lot of the rooms and what the actual property looks like on the outside. But not much of this comes about like plot wise. It kind of just keys us into the actual type of person that cousin Francis was. We learn a lot, just like a lot of knickknacks and stuff that he held around. Then we also learn of the people who are taking care of it, the Donovans, Mr. Donovan and his 2 daughters, Hannah and Mary. We kind of end with Stella. It's like this whole weird scene where like Stella wakes up, she doesn't even realize where she is, she doesn't actually know. She like goes out and like looks at like the very like early daylight. Then there's like this whole thing where the Donovans come out, they're like, we won. And really it was just talking about a victory of Montgomery in Egypt, and this whole thing was like, Roderick's gonna become a general and stuff like this. Spoiler alert, he doesn't. Chapter 10 is kind of the beginning of like the end, because there's only 17 chapters, and some of them are shorter than others. Chapter 10 starts off Stella. She gets off the train from leaving like this almost like resort-esque place, to find Robert. And like I'm pretty sure it's raining in this like scene right now. She's on the train station. She finds Robert, and they're gonna go off. But his sister's also in the car. They have this whole conversation, like a 3-way conversation, where like his sister's being weird, like usual. And then as soon as like his sister leaves, like Stella, I can't remember what happens first, but it's like Robert either asks him to for her to marry him, or Stella's like, I know that you're a spy, or like not accuses him, but just says, somebody that I trust told me that you're a spy for the enemy. It starts this whole fight, this whole debacle and stuff like that. And then they go to dinner, and the entire time is like this pseudo fight, but like also just got the discussion about like their love and like what this means, if it's actually true. And Robert like completely denies it, and just a whole bunch of stuff. And it's like, Robert is like, marry me, and she's like, but no, but kind of yes, almost, because I love you a lot. And he's like, I love you too. Chapter 11. This chapter starts with a letter from Roderick, actually, to Stella, and it's basically saying that like he's sorry for that he was like sorry for something. I can't exactly remember what, but then he just starts talking about the property again. Like he's like, I'm sorry, Mom, for whatever, and then he's like, but that property though, pretty bussin'. Then the rest is him going to the property for the first time, meeting all the people there, like without even like telling his mom. He's like he just shows up. I think after I don't even think he's like fully deployed. I think he leaves at the end of the chapter, but he's like shows up and he meets like the Donovans and stuff, and then he ends up talking to cousin Nettie, who, as we know, is mentally unwell or queer in this time period of Francis. But super important information, super T drama. She actually tells him the truth about the divorcing of Victor and Stella. And it turns out it wasn't Stella who divorces Victor first. Victor was in love with his nurse because after he like got injured and stuff from the war, and then I think he marries Stella, but he's still like in love with this nurse, even though he tried to make it work with Stella. And then he's like, Stella, I gotta be honest with you, you do not hit the same as this nurse. And Stella goes, you know what? Screw that. Instead of being the loser, I'm going to be the Giga Chad, the boss bitch I am, and then divorce your ass. And everybody thinks I'm the monster. Because this is the 1940s, and a woman divorcing a man? Come on. That's crazy. She's actually his property in most parts. Oh, yeah, he's still at the place. And it's actually, nobody actually knows about this except for cousin Nettie and stuff. And then the chapter ends. Chapter 12 starts with him calling his mom instead of writing her a letter. Calling her mom, and he said, I freaking know about Dad. He's like, I know about all of it, and it changes everything. It changes how I see everything in this world. Super dramatic. And then the call ends, and then Stella like turns around, and she's like, and then she just and then Harrison's just like sitting in the flat, and he's just like, oh, who was it? She goes, it was my son. Talking about some BS or whatever. Then we get to another important scene where Harrison and her go to dinner. And basically the whole time that they're actually walking to dinner, Stella is just like talking about Roderick and stuff like that and just kind of like blowing steam off or venting a little bit. Harrison, it seems like he doesn't actually really care what she's saying. And he's just like leading her along. He's like, this way, madam, we have to go this way. And then like leads her into this place that she's never been. She doesn't even know where she is. But they get to dinner. And Harrison kind of just like lays out the facts on the table a little bit. He goes, I know. And she's like, what are you talking about? Like the whole time she's like, I didn't do anything. I'm innocent. And Harrison's like, that's Cap Jr. And then, Stella then tries to take the upper hand and is like, well, if I can't deny it, then I'm just going to make him angry enough to where that he just kind of gives up. And so that's what she tries to do. She tries to make him angry and stuff like that, and he gets more and more frustrated, all until, out of the corner of their eye, they see Louis Lewis. Who could have expected it? The crazy main character, side character, who doesn't even really matter. But she shows up, and then she sees them. She makes eye contact with Harrison. She's like, I know your ass, and I've been looking for you. And then she like totally butts in their conversation by like making up this whole excuse that like the dog at the restaurant, which isn't her dog, is actually her dog. She goes, this is my dog's Spot. Both looking down, they see that dog does not have a single spot on it, and they're like, that's a weird name for a dog that doesn't have spots. And she's like, anyways, Harrison, what's up? And then Harrison gets so frustrated and stuff like that. And Louis just seems like oblivious to it. She just wants to talk to Harrison. And then Stella was like, oh shit, I got an opportunity here. And then they both start to like badger him a little bit. Harrison, he figures out he has enough. He has the power in this situation. He's gonna put his foot down. This ends up with Harrison just like telling both of them off. And then he's like, I made my decision. And Stella was like, oh, what decision? Still acting stupid. And he was like, you know what decision I made. And then Stella and Louis go off. Stella's like, oh, gosh. What did he do? And, Harrison pays the bill. And they all leave. Stella and Louis actually walk, like, home. Like, she walks her home and stuff like that. And interaction between like Stella and Louis actually kind of like, it's not like it turns out into something, but it's like Louis kind of like latches on to Stella a little bit after that. Chapter 13, like I said, is one of these Louis chapters. Chapter 13 is just Louis being dropped off by Stella, and then Stella coming home to Connie, her big dommy mommy, and then being like, just telling her, She's like, everything that happened. She goes, I'm Millie Harrison, and then the dog of the spots, and Connie's like, you're a freaking idiot, and then that's just it. That's like the whole chapter. They just talk. They just have pillow talk before they go to sleep. Chapter 14 is about Robert going back to his family's house because guess what? Somebody bought the house. Who could believe it? Who could believe it? Somebody wants to buy the house in this economy. It's a recession out here. But essentially, he gets there. They bicker about it. He wants to sell the house. The rest of the people don't want to sell the house. You know, there's a whole lot of like emotional stuff, or like they think it's very sentimental because they've lived in it for so long. Robert's just like, it's like another mention of his dad's failures, so he wants to get rid of it. They all just start like basically arguing. There's a whole thing with like Robert being like questioned by his like nieces and nephews who are like, why are you never here? You're never here. We love you so much. And he has like this whole sort of like pseudo epiphany or whatever, because I think he realizes at this point that he's been had by Harrison and stuff, because he changes up his habits and stuff with all the spy work that he's been doing. So there's like this whole emotional moment where he's like, oh, maybe I should, stay with my relatives more. But then he leaves after that because we learn later in the next couple of chapters that he really misses Stella. So yeah, that's just about all of them. Chapter 14. Chapter 15, we're back in Stella's flat, and Robert, he just misses Stella, and he knows this is the end. And it's basically this whole chapter is just Robert going, I'm the spy. Who could have thought? Who could have guessed it? Harrison's right. And then she talks about why they kind of just start it's like a pseudo crying fest where they're just oh, I love you and I love you and all this crap and stuff like that. Whole bunch of emotional stuff. And then Robert's like, oh, he knows I'm here, so I gotta leave. I gotta dip. And so I was like, well, not out the front door, because Robert's like, not out the front door, because he hears people coming up from there, and they can't be in the back because Harrison is a freaking genius. He would obviously know that there's a back door. So then Stella's like, the roof, and Robert's like, oh, that is the smartest thing I've ever heard in my entire life, Stella. You are a genius in the making. So then Robert goes out the roof, and then we shortly find out afterwards he falls to his death. Who could have thought that in the 1940s London English apartments that you could not jump from roof to roof in your bedtime clothes? I don't know. Who would have fucking thought? Chapter 16 is they talk about more about the victories in the war. A lot of these chapters after this kind of just speed up through time a little bit and just give a timeline briefly of what's happening in the general world. And then Stella meets up with Roderick because of his last phone call where he says he knows all this stuff, and they talk about it. And Stella's just very she's just very open with him, and she just says all this stuff and that he probably should move on. And then they have this whole philosophical stuff about being a person and having thoughts and stuff. And then Roderick kind of apologizes. He's like, I'm sorry I brought this up because I realized that you don't care about it anymore, so I shouldn't care about it anymore. But then he gets back to talking about his property. He's talking about the bank he's making. He's talking about his future. Oh, and he also asked about Robert because he knew that Robert and Stella were dating. And Stella's just 100% honest with him because, they're both adults. Stella just goes, yeah, he was a traitor of our country and he fell to his death because he was trying to run away from being arrested. And Roderick's just like, okay, well, anyways, was there a boat on the property? That's kind of the whole thing. Now we are at the final. We are at the end. We're at the end of this 372-page novel about nothing. We're at the end. Final chapter. And it starts with a one-sided conversation, like I said previously, of Stella talking to this mortician about all the stuff that happened on the night of Robert's death. And it's very, I think this is the best part of the book because it's it's a one-sided conversation that we hear. We never hear what the mortician says, but we can infer through her answers what he did ask, and it seems so pointed and stuff, and it's very concise, and it actually takes up 4 whole pages of her just answering questions in this methodical way that a mortician would ask them. It's pretty good. So and then there's the time skip previously. It is now 2 years later, and we learn what's happened in those 2 years. Stella moves across London into another flat off Victoria Street instead of Weymouth Street. Harrison completely vanishes from London. The house actually doesn't get sold because Robert's not there to have his opinion. Roderick obtained his commission in the autumn of 1943, and he always stayed at working in the same factory. Louis lived off of Chillicombe Street under the surveillance of Connie, who now she's back in action because she's in because of like the renewed tax in 1944 of a very important event that we'll talk about called the Little Blitz. She, because of her position as a warden, comes back and is now like very present in Louis' life. We also like learned a little bit more about like Robert and how they met, and it was 2 years ago in actually 1940, because that was important in the mortician's conversation that they had, where he was like, "How much do you actually know about him?" And she's like, "Well, I only knew him for 2 years, so as much as you can know a person in 2 years." Then there's a glimpse into Louis' life as the war progresses, and we get more insight all the way up to February in 1944 of the air bombings in London called the Little Blitz, which is kind of like the second to last setting that we get, as then we cut back through all this, like all this stuff happens, and we get Harrison's perspective, and it's like this war-torn, bombed city, and then he finds Stella again. She's like, "How did you find me?" He goes, "I have my ways," and then they just have this whole conversation where Stella's like, "Harrison, I'm getting married again to a cousin of a cousin." He goes, "Is he at least a brigadier?" And it's all like that stuff, and that kind of ends shortly because they kind of realize they don't have much to say to each other. But like, it's also weird because like Stella almost seems like she's finally in love with him or something at the end there, but she's still getting married. So then we cut off to Louis, who we find out is told Connie. She was like, "I need you to write a letter to my husband, and I need you not to tell him that I'm having a baby because he's not here, whatever." And then she leaves. Louis just leaves off into the Midland country. And then the final scene is her like having this child that she's named Tom Victor, which is, I believe, yeah, she named him Thomas Victor, which is so ironic considering, like, I mean, I imagine Stella did tell her on the night that they walked, like, her ex-husband maybe, but, like, so weird. But, yeah, she tells Thomas Victor, she has this kid, and then he's growing up, and he apparently looks exactly like Thomas. And then the final scene is of, like, her showing Thomas these 3 swans that are, like, migrating, because it was this whole, and that relates all the way back to a different chapter where she's like pillow talking with Connie, and then she talks about these migrating birds, about like what her dad said previously, and it's all like, "Oh my gosh, migrating birds, she said that previously. Can you believe that? Can you believe that she said that previously?" I cannot understate the hate that I have for this book. I've never hated a book this much. I've never been more bored reading than this book, and I'll be so glad when I never have to look at it again. I will say one thing, though. I did unknowingly. This is the only book that they have in the library of this book, by the way. This is the only book that they have. But I didn't realize that I had already previously bought it at the bookstore. So I didn't need to do that. But I now own it forever. Can you believe that? Owning it forever? Like, you actually just own it forever. Anyways, insane. That's the end of number 000.